Vanguards are a broken class and have been for a long time. And I'm not just talking about Myrtle existing, but well, we'll get to that. But for the first time in a long time, I'm actually optimistic about the direction HG is going with the class. And it's all thanks to the new 5-star, Matsukiri. He is the debut of a brand new Vanguard archetype, Strategists. And the design of that subclass, I think, points to a very interesting step forward in how HG is designing their Vanguards. But before we get into that, let's go over his kit. Strategists seem familiar, but are also very unique. On the surface, they're a lot like Pioneers, which I know will scare some people off, but bear with me. They have 2 block and overall very similar stats, though Matsukiri has notably higher attack than the 5-star Pioneers. In fact, he actually has higher base attack than the 6-star Pioneers as well, along with higher defense, some res, and comparable HP. And this is very nice to have since, as you'll see from his talent and skills, he's designed to stay on the field for a bit. But where he and his subclass really set themselves apart from Pioneers is in the fact that they can support undeployed operators while on the field, and in fact we see that right off the bat in Matsukiri's talent. That talent lets him buff the attack of all supporters and defenders in the deployment waiting zone once he's been on the field for 30 seconds. Now, this buff is conditional, but him being out there for 30 seconds really isn't that high of a bar, given that you're going to have him out there to generate DP anyway. In fact, it's only 5 seconds longer than the total time it takes him to finish his first S2 activation, so you really don't have to go out of your way to trigger it. Though, back to that Pioneer comparison. His first skill is also very Pioneer-like. Like your regular Pioneer S1s, it's an auto-activated skill that grants a set amount of DP immediately upon activation, though a bit less DP in exchange for it being on a shorter cooldown versus the 5-star Pioneers. However, it's not just about the DP that it generates, as it also reduces the DP cost of the highest cost unit in your deployment zone, which, if you count that with the DP he generates, is actually a higher rate than the 5-star Pioneers. It's also nice that it specifically targets the highest cost unit that you have. While they're not guaranteed to be the next unit you're going to deploy, so the immediate impact on your opening isn't exactly guaranteed, they're generally the units that are the most difficult to deploy. Knocking 4 DP off the cost of your heavy hitters can be very substantial when it comes to getting the momentum you need to push through a stage, and paired with his DP gen helping you get everyone else out there too, and it's pretty solid all around. Plus, this effect stacks, and given that you're going to want him out there for at least 30 seconds to get his talent buff going, and 2 activations of his skill take 40 seconds, and that can be really nice for settling into a stage. However, it's not without its limitations, and I wouldn't suggest that it's his main skill. The main reason for that is that it offers nothing apart from that DP gen. While his talent will still give him some extra utility in buffing your supporters and defenders, this will not help him expand upon that utility. And without any kind of buff to his damage or survivability, he won't be contributing nearly as much while on the field either. This is where his second skill picks up. His skill 2 recovers more DP on a lower cooldown, though does so over a longer duration rather than doing so instantly. It boosts his attack substantially, lets him recover 10% of his max HP per second, reduces the cost of defenders and supporters in your deployment waiting zone by 1 each, and finally buffs their max HP by 15%, with this buff stacking up to 2 times. The DP generation of the skill is also respectable, being slightly ahead of Flametail's S3 DP per second and slightly behind Vulpes Foglia and her talent plus her S3. This isn't to say that he's better than Flametail or worse than Ingrid, but I wanted to give you some context for what he's doing and highlight the fact that his buffing utility has not compromised his DP generation. And in fact, given that this comparison doesn't count for the DP cost reduction that he can provide, in terms of DP, he's quite competitive, especially considering that both Flametail and Vulpes Foglia are 6 stars. The rest of the effects of the skill beyond DP generation have a lot to like too. For one, the combination of his attack increase and HP recovery make him overall pretty good at holding his own while you have him out there. He's kind of like a mini Vulpes Foglia in that way, not quite with her damage and survivability, but he'll definitely feel familiar if you've used her in the past. But on top of that, he also has more buffs for undeployed supporters and defenders. Now, this is where I have to talk about his buff targets. Because the reality is that when you think about buffing units, it's usually not your defenders or supporters. Most of the time, you want to buff your main DPS, not necessarily the units that are holding enemies in place for those DPS units. However, with more and more powerful units in those subclasses, I do think that this still has value. For one, defenders are going to be some of your highest cost units, so having some DP reduction for them is a nice thing to have. And giving them more HP helps them pretty much across the board, while the extra attack from his talent can help the healing options heal and the DPS options DPS. Meanwhile, for supporters, it's also slightly awkward, but generally still pretty nice. Supporters don't generally have that high DP cost, so you might not think as much about reducing their costs, but once you deploy them for a bit less DP each, that's a bit more DP that you save for the expensive units that come after them. So still, not a bad benefit. They're also not terrible buff targets overall. Bards will always like the extra attack, as that lets their attack buffing go even harder, and Civilite Eterna in particular likes the extra HP for her S3. Abjurers are surprisingly durable, so they can make the extra HP go pretty far. And given that their healing is characterized by smaller heals that happen more frequently as compared to traditional medics, the extra attack they get from his talent can be greatly appreciated. And ritualists like Tragodia and Virtuosa only get faster at applying their respective statuses with each attack. Plus, if you're playing IS6, I can pretty much guarantee that you'll be using a certain summoner who has a talent that gives her summons a certain percentage of her attack and HP, letting her pass along any buffs she might receive. So while not nearly as practical as buffing some other classes, he can still definitely offer tangible benefits that you will be able to feel in your gameplay. In fact, one thing I've been enjoying is pairing him with the Sui squad. That team will often leave you running 2 or 3 defenders plus a supporter depending on the stage and which of the siblings you have. And given that the only cheap to deploy one has to ramp up his main skill, having a vanguard that helps you get them all out faster while also buffing most of them is a really comfy add to the squad. So while his buffs aren't going to be super crazy meta or anything, they still feel nice. And he offers a nice change of pace from using Ines in literally every stage. The one downside of his buffing is that it's an additive boost to HP and attack, meaning that when buffing units whose skills also provide additive buffs to those stats, the impact can be diluted. So when looking for buff targets, I recommend looking for units that have multiplicative attack scales, or little to no attack boosts in their skills or talents, in order to get the most out of the buffs Matsukiri can provide. But the really exciting thing about him and his kit is how he and the new subclass relate to HG's Vanguard class design as a whole. See, like I said at the top, Vanguards have been broken for a long time. They're honestly probably the hardest class to balance, only really alongside medics. But the problem doesn't even start with Vanguards, it starts with DP. Because you either need so little DP that a Vanguard is irrelevant to your ability to clear a stage, or you need so much DP that your choice of which Vanguard is pretty much irrelevant. Let me explain. One of the biggest things I've learned while playing niche knights is how many stages just don't need a Vanguard. My niche, Litanian Knights, is almost entirely units that cost above 20 DP, and it does not have a Vanguard. Now, there are absolutely stages that are just not possible for the niche because of that, but surprisingly few. I've cleared some stages that, frankly, you would not think would be possible without a unit to help with the setup. And that's with some pretty expensive to deploy units. These days, with more and more sub-20 DP cost, DPS, and lane holding units, if you're not specifically forced to open with Ebenholz and Carnelian, you're probably going to be pretty okay just about anywhere and won't really need a Vanguard, let alone multiple. Meanwhile, in content where you do need a Vanguard, like in CC, a lot of the time you're going to want 2. DP just isn't like DPS. With a hard cap of 99 and permanently set values for each operator, there's just a limit to how much DP generation can be power crept. There are plenty of DPS scenarios where it'd take 3 year 1 ops to do what 1 year 6 op can do. But DP gen just can't really work in the same way. To go from 2 Vanguards to 1 in a CC squad, You'd need a unit that doubled the DP gen of like a Flag Bearer, and that's just not really a tenable solution. While DPS checks and varying mechanics can balance the game around changing DPS caps and counter-specific high DPS options, there just isn't really anywhere for them to go with increasing DP generation. Like, if they did release a Vanguard that doubled Psylocke or Ines's DP gen, where would they go from there? But this puts Vanguards in a difficult spot. While it's a lot easier for the game to encourage players to go after new DPS units, and even after other types of utility units, it's a lot harder to justify new Vanguards. I mean, one of the most commonly used is still a 4-star that released before I even started playing the game. And while Myrtle has definitely been power crouched multiple times at this point, she's still super easy to get, cheap to raise, and has more than enough DP for just about anything you could ever want. No, she's not the best Vanguard these days, but why raise a unit that'll give you what, 2 more DP than she would? And it's taken HG a while to figure out how to fully justify that. And they've tried to do it in a few ways. For one, they've just made more combat-ready Vanguards. Units like Mulzus, Flametail, and Vulpes Foglia are all very competent lane holders, especially early in a stage. And I still think that Ingrid is a fantastic example of how to design a Vanguard while gearing them around the content that most people actually play. But those haven't really taken hold in the way that I think HG might have wanted. And that's kind of fair. So long as they don't let them be as strong as normal guards, and as long as they keep releasing cheap to deploy actual DPS and lane holding units, these sorts of Vanguards are going to be a tough sell. So that leaves them with another option. Utility, and this has seen some more success. Ines and Psylocke are probably the 2 most meta Vanguards in the game. And while Ines is definitely a very competent damage dealer, their status is because of each of their utility. Ines has crowd control, invis reveal, her own camo, and debuffing, all on a short redeploy timer. And Psylocke has buffing, debuffing, healing, and crowd control on her end. But still, both of these have kind of seemed like one-off units. While the other Flag Bearers definitely have their utility, none of them have quite as flexible or far-reaching utility as Psylocke. And for Ines, well, Chilchuck will always have CCB 3 at least, but Surfer arguably has less utility than her predecessors. I mean, she doesn't even have the invisibility that they gave Cantabile. So, for a while now, it's felt like we needed a new utility-focused Vanguard archetype to really finally shake up the Vanguard meta. And honestly, I think HG might have finally done it. Strategists can hold their own on the field like Pioneers, but unlike those Pioneers, give you a compelling reason to put them out there that other lane-holding options just can't provide. And if HG keeps going in this direction, I'm finally really looking forward to seeing where Vanguards go from here. Hey, thanks for watching. Before I sign off, I wanted to shout out my stream chat. I actually hadn't super looked into Matsukiri's kit when he was announced on CN, but a couple months ago someone in chat asked me what I thought of him, and I had to actually look into what he did for the first time. And I'm really glad that I did, because there's some really cool stuff there. And he very quickly went from a unit that I hadn't really thought about to one of my most anticipated. So check out my streams, I guess, and you too could accidentally influence the next video I make. But that's it for me. Thanks to my channel members, and until next time, Auf Wiedersehen.